While I've got the shock out on the Suzuki, I started reading a few posts about the linkage mechanism and how it tends to be very dry. So for some reason Suzuki don't quite like putting grease on their mechanism. I don't know why you wouldn't want to do that, but what I'm going to do is while I've got this shock out, I'm actually going to pull it to pieces and give it a bit of a grease, which will help with protection and movement obviously. So I'll leave the back wheel on so it supports the rear swinging arm, because it's sitting on the bottom of the bench at the moment. And then I'll whip out the rear linkage. So I've got the bike on the lift at the moment, so I'll pick the bike up. That's probably high enough. And you can see there you get a much better look at the linkage from under here. So just 1, 2, looks like about 3 bolts and it all comes to pieces. So it's a pretty easy job to do when I've got it to this stage. And what made me also think about it is when I pulled the shock bolt out, so this one's from the bottom I think, when I pulled the shock bolt out, it's absolutely dry. There is nothing on it at all. It is zinc plated, but you'd think they would put a little bit of grease on the bolt itself to stop corrosion. So what I'll do is when I reassemble the shock as well, I might put some grease on that as well. It doesn't need it because the shock actually moves, or the bushing moves, and so it doesn't really, the bolt doesn't move as such. It's just to stop corrosion. So I'll take the 3 bolts out. I'll have a look what the state of them are, and then we can reassemble them with some decent grease on them. Right, here we go. I can tell you something, Suzuki doesn't muck about with torque. Holy shit, those bolts were hard to get off. So that's it out there, and it was it too bad? It was tough. It was pretty tough. Some of the bolts were really hard to get off. I saw in the manual they're about 100 Newton meters or something, so they're pretty tight. So luckily I've got a breaker bar. I've got a 750 breaker bar, and that helped with most of them. The ones at the back, I just did them with the spanners. But I'm a fairly big bloke and I go to the gym, so luckily I could get a good pull on them. But what I also saw, I don't know if you've thought about this bolt, this nut in here, it actually has a torque setting, but you can't actually get a socket into it. So I started thinking, the Japanese would have thought about this, and right enough. If you take the brake pedal off, you can get a 3/8 inch bar, you can just see right there, through to a socket, and then you can torque it up. And so that brake pedal pivot lines up exactly with the suspension linkage bolt. I'll tell you something, these bloody Japanese engineers, they're bloody smart. So to torque it up, I've taken my brake pedal off, and I'll get a 3/8 inch extension bar, and then I can get into the nut. Now, the reason for taking this off was to see what the lubrication was like. And as you might expect, there is hardly anything on these at all. These ones here, these are sleeves. If I can push that out. These are sleeves that come out, and they are pretty dry. There is hardly any grease on them at all. So what I've decided to do, I've started a GoFundMe page for Suzuki, GoFundMe grease, and we can see if we can get some extra grease sent to Japan for Suzuki. None of these linkages have got hardly any grease on them at all. It seems to be a very white lithium grease or something, but it's all very dry. The bolts have got nothing on them, they're completely dry. You can see my hands, they're fairly clean there. Interestingly, I started to get a little bit of dust penetrating the rear linkage here. So this one, yeah, got a little bit of dust starting to get past that side seal there. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get some I've got some lithium grease in the other shed, and I'll pack all this with better grease, and then I'll get it all back together. And while I was taking this apart, my suspension bits have also arrived. So so that was a bit of a win getting that off, because I think once I get it greased I won't have to worry about it again. And the brake pedal as well, the brake pedal came off and there's hardly anything on that pivot either. And so they certainly don't go to town with too much grease on these bikes. So if you can, as soon as you can get your pivot off, get it greased, and then you don't have to worry about it. Okay, let's get this greased and back on. Now, one of the reasons, just to let you know, I didn't do a video of how you disassemble it and everything. There's plenty of videos out there on people taking off the linkages and shocks. And so the reason I actually did this was just to show you, this is a new bike. It's only got about 1,000 kilometers on it. And the new bike has hardly any grease in the pivots and thing. And so just let you know that you really should get into it as quick as you can, and get yourself get some decent grease on these pivots, and so it protects it for its life. I know some people have said they've done 30,000 kilometers and they haven't greased it and thing, but I'm willing to bet you've got a bit of play in there now. And the other thing is, if you don't put grease on your bolts, they're going to rust in, and that's going to be a tough job once you start taking them off. So okay, so the as I said, I'll get some lithium grease on this, and let's get it all back together. Just before I get started here, you can see how some red dust has actually got past this seal already. So it definitely needs to be packed with a bit more grease, and so I'll get that packed now, and that'll be good. Right, so there we are. I've packed it with Bellray waterproof grease. That gets recommended for all these sort of things. I've took every pivot out. Hopefully I've put them all back in, and pushed the bolts through. Now, a little bit of a secret here, that all the torque that is specified is obviously for a dry bolt, and now I've got all my bolts covered in grease. And so there's two alternatives. You can try drying it off a little bit, or you can drop your torques a little bit, because most of the torque that is specified is actually dry torque, not wet torque. So the problem I've got at the moment is all my bolts are covered with waterproof grease. So I'll just dry them off a little bit, and then we'll get a better torque setting. I might even drop the torque just a little bit so I don't over torque the bolts. As I said, torque tends to be specified dry torque, and of course now I've got all my bolts covered in grease at the ends there, because you had to push them through the grease. That'll be especially important for this one here, for the shock absorber. And so we'll see, I'll have a look at what the torque is going to be, and then I might knock it down a little bit. Okay, that's how you get to the front nut. I can't believe how easy it is once you work out how to do it. So it's a 3/8 inch, I've got 150mm bar, which is about 6 inches. And I think that's a 17mm socket. Yeah, 17mm socket, and the torque wrench. And it's supposed to be about 80 Newton meters. I've actually set it to, I think, probably can't see it, I've set it to 65. And that's because there's grease on the threads. And so when you have grease on the threads, you should be reducing about 38%, I think, which would take me to 55, which was a bit too low, so I bumped up to 65. These ones should be 100 Newton meters, so they should be about 70 with grease, so I'll take them to 85 or something. And that'll be way enough to hold it in place, because remember, all it's doing is holding the bushing against the frame or the bushing against the arms, and they're moving. The actual bolt isn't doing much work itself. So I've packed all the bushings with grease, greased the bolt body or the bolt shaft, and torqued them up to what they need to be. And so I'm happy with that. I think that'll last me a long time. And what I'll also do is I'll get, when I put this back in, when I put the footrest back in, the rear brake back in, I'll make sure that's all greased properly as well. So here's the shock back from Vince Strang, all rebuilt with a new spring. If I get the old spring out, actually it's very different, isn't it? So I can line it up somewhere. You can see that it's slightly longer. What's that, 15mm longer. Coils are much thicker, and it looks like it's got more coils per inch as well, or whatever you call it. And so that is a substantially bigger spring than the old one. So that's the old one there. That's the old brand new one. It's only had 1,000 kilometers. If anybody wants to buy a 6.5 kilogram per millimeter spring, brand new, no marks on it. Okay, so what I'll do now is I'll go and drop this in, and we'll talk about finishing the rear suspension off. Now, I read a few things about torque. The top one is about 55 Newton meters, I think, and the bottom one, it's actually, because it's only going into a thin alloy, you have to be very careful with that. It recommends 30, 35 I've read, or 37. I might even go slightly less and see what I'm going to do for that. Anyway, there's the new shock, substantially thicker, more coils, and a little bit taller. And that should be a vast improvement on this soft original one. Let's get it in, and I'll show you if there's any issues. That was the easiest job I've ever done on a motorcycle. If anybody says don't take your airbox out, ignore them. My shock just dropped straight through the top, straight in, and engaged with the bottom, and then it just flops back and fell into the upper mount. I've torqued the upper mount to 50 and the lower mount to 35. The lower mount did have some grease on the threads, because that's a roller bearing at the bottom, and there was some grease in it when I pushed it through. But the top just seems to be a rubber bearing, so that must just move with the rubber. It doesn't seem to be a roller bearing up the top there. And so basically that's the top torqued, bottom torqued. The only thing to do now is to set the preload. So what I'll do is I'll tidy up a bit and then set the preload it later. I've got a few other bits and pieces I need to do. And so what I'll do now is I'll tidy up, and then I'll set the preload in a different video. But that was a really easy job. Recommend, take your airbox out, take your carburetor rubber off, and the shock just drops straight in. These Suzukis are so well designed. They are really simple. Anyway, that's the shock in. Looks good. And next job.